Now, the defenders of these restrictions say they are needed to preserve neighbourhood character, and indeed the most common objection to high-rise apartment buildings is that they would harm neighbourhood character and undermine prices. Now, in a new paper, Does High-Rise Development Damage Neighbourhood Character? Peter, with the support of his research assistants, they find that these developments have little effect on nearby housing prices. And with that, please welcome our Chief Economist, Peter Tulip.
Thanks, Tom. I'm going to speak for most of my time today. I'll talk about that paper. But before I do that, I want to talk more broadly about the issue of housing affordability and the contribution of zoning restrictions to that, to provide a bit of context and a bit of motivation. So there's been a lot of research, both in Australia and overseas, that finds zoning regulations or planning restrictions or land use regulations, however you call it, have a huge effect on housing prices. So here are some recent estimates for Australia. One thing I want to focus on, in the bottom left corner, we have apartments in Sydney, where we estimate that planning restrictions raise the cost of an apartment by about $350,000. It raises the cost by 68%. And we get bigger effects for detached houses, and it applies, here I'm just showing Sydney and Melbourne, but there's a problem is widespread. So where do these numbers come from? We estimate the sale price of the average new apartment in Sydney is about $870,000. It only costs about $519,000 to supply that apartment. And we calculate that as the sum of construction costs, marketing, finance, a normal level of profit, and so on, is how we get that. And there's a whole paper explaining where these numbers come from. One of the important things to know about this, though, that's obvious to economists, but puzzling to non-economists, is we don't include land in the cost of the apartment, because we're looking at the cost of, because apartments can be supplied inexpensively by going up. You don't need extra land to supply apartments. It's what economists call the marginal cost, not the average cost. What are the resources society needs to forego to provide this housing? So you've got this huge gap of $350,000, which is sustained by planning regulations. I think to interpret that, it helps to look at a supply-demand diagram that people may remember from their high school economics. Those for whom this is unfamiliar, I'm just going to ask for forbearance for one slide. This is as technical as we get. So in a free market, supply and demand will equal each other at a point like E, where you get, which determines prices and quantities. But the housing market in Australia is not free. We have restrictions that say what you can build, where you can build it, how high it can be, the floor area ratio, setbacks, a whole lot of restrictions that have in common that there are a restriction on the quantity of housing. And you can think of that as shown by the red line there. And this is analogous to other quantitative restrictions that governments impose, such as taxi licenses or import quotas. And like them, you get a the price substantially greater than the cost of supply. And it's that difference there that is our $350,000. That's the effect of the zoning restrictions. That approach to estimating these huge effects is well established in the research literature. That I'd like to claim that we're doing original, insightful work, but actually we're just copying an approach that's been used very widely overseas. So people have done the same approach in New York, Auckland, Switzerland, Britain, a lot of other European cities, and they all come up with the same result. Well, sorry, it differs significantly from city to city, But the common pattern is that there are huge effects of planning restrictions on the cost of housing. And that approach is not controversial within the research literature. That it's very widely cited. It's endorsed in surveys of the large literature that appear in the very top journals. Now, when these issues are discussed in public, in the media, there will be a lot of criticisms from town planners and resident action groups and so on. Those criticisms reflect typically very simple misunderstandings of the research. People think supply and demand doesn't matter, that all economics is nonsense. And I guess they're entitled to that view, but the point I do want to make is that within the expert community, these views are fairly well settled. So that's the general context that we've done today's paper. There's a lot of research showing planning restrictions are important, but one serious limitation of the research is that it doesn't show whether those restrictions are good or bad. It just shows that they're large. And so that question is the topic that we want to address today, that we've addressed in this current paper. And as Tom said, the most common objection you get to high-rise apartments is that it would ruin neighbourhood character. There would be a deterioration in the amenity of the neighbourhood that we live in. Local residents complain about the traffic, noise, they think the new buildings are ugly, that they block out the sun, and so on. And I'm not going to say that any of those arguments are wrong. People are entitled to their opinion. It's a statement of values on which we should agree to disagree. What I do want to argue is that those views are not representative of the whole housing market, that there are large numbers of potential home buyers that actually like high density, that they like proximity to transport, they like proximity to shops, all the other features that accompany high-rise building. And one loose bit of evidence that is very easy to verify is you see this in real estate advertisements, where all of these features are typically boasted about as selling points. So real estate agents, at least, are aware that lots of home buyers like high density. We have two very different sets of preferences that somehow policymakers need to balance. How do they decide which of these views is more important? And the standard way that economists will quantify and then compare competing preferences is through willingness to pay. So if an unattractive building does go up in a neighbourhood that does reduce neighbourhood amenity, people will be more inclined to move out, fewer people will be inclined to move in, sellers will outnumber buyers and the price will fall. And that price will keep falling until the reduction in price compensates for the change in amenity. And so the market in that process is putting a dollar figure on the preferences. We're measuring willingness to pay to be near or to avoid these developments. And so we're going to try to answer this question through the lens of house prices. In particular, we look at 5 prominent examples of high-density construction in Sydney: Chatswood, Forest Lodge, Green Square, Liverpool and Torella. And I'll mention some of the unusual features of this. There's a variety within these examples. We selected them to show different aspects of the problem. But what we're going to look at is how did prices change in these areas before and after the development? For that to be a meaningful estimate, you need to know what prices would have done otherwise. And so for a counterfactual or a control, we use the adjoining suburbs. And I'll discuss that soon. The important underlying assumption is that the factors that boost house prices in our 5 examples would also boost prices in the adjoining suburbs. Our first example is Chatswood. As any of you that have driven up and down the Pacific Highway in the last 10 years will know, there's been a transformation of the skyline when you pass through Chatswood. That in 2013, the tallest building was about 30 stories high. In the 2 years following that, another 6 towers were put in, all of which were taller. The highest now is 40 stories. And you can see the new buildings from 10, 20 kilometres away. And that development, those towers became a symbol of overdevelopment. And I have here in the slide 2 headlines from the Sydney Morning Herald from recent years of local residents saying, we don't want our neighbourhood to turn into another Chatswood. That's from that's from Linfield on the left and Crow's Nest on the right. So it's important in understanding the resident opposition Chatswood is a very good example, wondering, well, what actually did happen there? This chart shows house prices for Chatswood and the adjoining suburbs. Chatswood is the black dashed line, and the solid coloured lines are the adjoining suburbs, Roseville, Willoughby, Artarmon and Lane Cove North. And there are a few interesting features of the chart. And the grey shaded area in the middle is the period of rapid construction. That's when the big towers went up. And what you can see is that prices in Chatswood I should mention these are house prices, so they don't include the new apartments. But they're all near the apartments, so they're trying to capture some kind of externality or spillover effect or change in the neighbourhood amenity. What you see is in the early part of the chart on the left that prices closely track each other, so that the adjoining suburbs are providing a good control for what prices would happen in Chatswood in the absence of some unusual shock. But then after the development, prices continued to move in line. There's no change in relative prices, and hence we infer in relative amenity. This chart shows very similar data, but from a slightly different perspective. We've averaged the 4 adjoining suburbs to give one simple counterfactual, a benchmark. That's given by the red line, and we've added 20 years of data to the beginning of the sample. So again, you can see that the adjoining suburbs provide a very good indication of what should be happening in Chatswood. So we have good controls. And then at the end, you can see again, there's very little effect at all. If anything, the relative amenity of Chatswood seems to have actually improved relative to the other suburbs. But the effect is small and temporary, so I think the key takeaway is that the effect is unimportant. Oh, just one point. The closeness of house prices prior to the development implies that housing in nearby suburbs are extremely close substitutes. And that has a lot of implications for research and research design, which we discuss in the paper. In particular, it means that housing markets, in some ways, not in all, but in some ways, operate very much as a perfectly competitive market would, in that one extra supplier can do very little to change the price of their good. Second example is Forest Lodge. About 10 years ago, the New South Wales Harness Racing Association decided to sell the Harold Park Paceway. The Paceway was just getting very old. It was increasingly distant from stables and a lot of the spectators. And they sold it to Mirvac, and in its place were constructed about 1,200 new apartments. And so the suburb of Forest Lodge was transformed. Whereas 10 years ago it was predominantly 2-storey terraces, now it has almost half of it is high-rises. One interesting feature about Forest Lodge is that the developments were externally driven, exogenous, as we economists say. That when we're doing research on this topic, it's often very difficult to distinguish cause and effect. Is it quantities driving prices or prices driving quantities? Here we've got a good example of a shock completely outside the real estate market driving developments. The other feature of Forest Lodge that's very interesting is there was very strong resident opposition. That Jamie Parker, the Greens MP for Balmain, led very active resident opposition. There were packed town meetings, petitions, and so on. And the residents and the opponents of the overdevelopment, as they called it, said that this is going to drive down property values and destroy the neighbourhood character. So what happened? Again, the dashed black line is prices in Forest Lodge, and the coloured lines are house prices in adjoining suburbs, Annandale, Camperdown and Glebe. And we see the same thing that we saw in Chatswood, that prices closely track each other prior to the construction. So the adjoining suburbs are providing a good control, a good counterfactual, and then following the development, they continue to track each other. These lines follow parallel paths. I don't want to get too repetitive, so this is the last one of this style. This time it's Liverpool. Liverpool is interesting partly because it's huge. There were 5,000 apartments have been supplied there recently, just in high-rises. And unusually, it's relatively unusual in that district. The adjoining suburbs, most of which we show there, showed very little development at all. So this is an example of a concentration of high-rise development in a sea of single-family detached housing. But again, we see the same problem of before the event, tracking very closely, so the adjoining suburbs are a good control, and then after the event, no apparent change in relative price or relative amenity. I won't show charts for these because essentially they show the same thing, but we see the same thing in other places we look at, Green Square and Torella. Green Square is interesting, just as huge. It's about 12,000 apartments. It's the biggest single concentration of development in New South Wales. Torella is interesting as a suburb that used to be all low-density housing and since then has been substantially transformed to now being half high-rise. And again, we get the same results. So our interpretation of all this evidence is that high-rise construction has minimal effect on relative house prices. And it follows from that there's no net effect on the relative amenity. But that's just our interpretation. You could look at the data and wonder whether there's some other story to tell about it. And in the paper, we discuss a range of possible alternative interpretations that we don't necessarily think they're completely implausible. And in fact, they do seem to work in some overseas markets, but they seem to be a very small part of the story in Sydney. So just to mention a few of them, you might think that providing a whole lot of housing in a suburb will drive down price through the normal supply and demand effects. And that maybe that this big supply effect is being offset by large positive spillovers. And in fact, that actually is the most common interpretation of high-rise development in the United States, that they think that researchers in America will often think that it has a very big supply effect offset by very positive effects on neighbourhood amenity. I don't want to argue about that because it's actually going to strengthen our conclusion. It says no, high-rises don't harm neighbourhood amenity. But it does seem implausible to us that you would get exactly offsetting effects in both timing and magnitude. And we have other reservations with this argument we discuss in the paper. Another possibility is that potential home buyers regard high-rise development as a signal that there'll be further rezonings in the area, and hence that nearby house prices might be rezoned to apartments in the near future, so become attractive for the option of getting a capital gain. Again, that essentially explains the same results as ours with a slightly different story. It means that homeowners are being compensated via capital gains rather than a change in neighbourhood amenity. So it's a question of how they're compensated, not whether, which is the central issue. That said, we don't think that this is an important part of the story going on here, partly because the overseas literature I talked about finds almost identical effects between rents and prices, and so which you wouldn't expect if capital gains were very important. And the last argument I'll make is that people often say, we think all the neighbours hate the new buildings, but they like the new amenities that come with it. They like the new shops and they like the new transport. And so aren't we combining two separate effects? Our argument is no, that you can't separate these, that you need the higher density to make the extra amenities feasible. So residents often want the extra facilities. You can't have them unless the density supports it. So my time's up. Just to conclude, we think any harm that's done to local amenity is offset by benefits to other home buyers who want to live in a lively or walkable neighbourhood. And it follows from that given that this is the main argument for zoning restrictions, we don't think those restrictions have much benefit. And from that it follows that they're increasing the cost of housing unnecessarily. Thanks a lot.
Peter, thank you very much, and we will take questions very soon. But before we do that, I'll try to subject your thesis to some scrutiny. If indeed, as you say, these housing restrictions, zone restrictions are so harmful, how do you account for the fact that they're still so popular?
So there are several reasons for that. One is, I think, there's an education problem. I think a lot of what I'm talking about now is not well understood by the public. I mean, it's in fact one of the main reasons I'm working in this job is because I think it's important to get some of these ideas out into the public. I think the CIS has a really important job to do in that respect. It is the case, though, that even if these effects were well understood, there would still be a lot of opposition. And part of the problem is that local governments represent the local residents, but they don't represent the potential buyers and buyers who will come from outside. And so that is an argument for making more of the decisions at a state or federal level than at a local level.
You obviously stress zoning. There are economists who'd say that the high levels of immigration, record low interest rates are the main drivers of the housing prices. How do you respond to those economists?
So I agree with them that these arguments are not alternatives. They're perfectly consistent. That high immigration or low interest rates will drive up house prices, but only if supply is unresponsive. If you get extra supply, you'll get an increase in quantity. We have an inflexible housing market, an inelastic supply curve that says that we respond to extra demand by boosting the price. So journalists will often ask, is it supply or demand? And economists will always answer, it's both. It's supply and demand. It's the interaction of inelastic supply with ever-increasing demand.
So does it follow then that the increase in supply will affect nearby house prices?
That's so if supply were to increase everywhere, we would get a reduction in house prices and we would get an improvement in affordability. But in one location, we don't see that. And that's, again, as I mentioned earlier, it's a bit like a competitive market. Think as an analogy, agriculture, that if one farmer doubles his output, he's not going to affect his price, he's not going to affect the price of his neighbour's farm, but if everyone does it, the overall price will collapse.
Okay. And given everything you've said, the policy implications?
So that's something we'd like to do more research on. That's on our agenda for looking at that. I mean, some answers are very simple. Just local governments and state governments should stop saying no and start saying yes. There's obviously a lot more to it, and that's one of the things we want to look at.
Okay, questions?
Adrian from Mirvac. Peter, would you say that it was a finding that house prices actually increased as a result of the developments?
You see that maybe most clearly in Chatswood. I mean, where the black line rises a little bit above the red line. My view is I'd say that that's small. The key point I would make is not much effect. You could look at that. It's going to, particularly when we look at some of the spaghetti charts, it's going to depend on exactly how you weight the adjoining numbers, and there's a lot of noise in the data. So that will happen in some places. Otherwise, you cut the data, you'd see a small reduction. And you see this actually in the overseas literature. We cite about 10 studies overseas, and I think about half of them see a small positive effect of 1 or 2%, and half see a small negative effect of 1 or 2%. I think the key takeaway is that it's very small.
Yeah, Steve Hamilton, Blueprint Institute. Great talk, Peter. Really, really interesting. The question I have is about distribution, not income distribution, but just redistribution between people, the people who are already living in those locations, the people who move in, right? So you could imagine a situation where the people who are living there are actually worse off potentially, but the people who move in are better off. And so I'm wondering if you've done any thinking about how to weigh off those concerns and to what extent those are the things that are driving a lot of the political resistance.
So half of what you said I strongly agree with, that the people moving in are better off, that there are these huge efficiency gains from trade, and that they'll be realised, and they will typically be split by the buyers and the suppliers. What I would push back on is that the local residents are worse off. If they were worse off, we would have seen that in a deterioration in nearby house prices. That prices in the immediate neighbourhood would have fallen relative to prices in adjoining suburbs. And so I don't think it's right that people living nearby are harmed.
Next question, yes.
I live in the eastern suburbs, and I disagree with most of your arguments. And right from the first chart, because the first chart you had a price of 800,000 for that one, and you didn't include the price of the land in the 873, but you did include in the 873 the price of the land because that was paid for in the price of the apartment, but didn't include in the 519. So the difference is very little, in fact, because most of that difference is due to the price of the land. That's one thing I thought was quite important to bring up. And the second thing is that one thing that you didn't mention, which is, you know, in the eastern suburbs, for the last 50 years, we've had no infrastructure. The last infrastructure was the Bondi train line, and there's been none since then. And we've got high rise density at Bondi Junction and medium density elsewhere. And what people are complaining about is the lack of infrastructure, not the high rise. So you didn't hardly mention infrastructure. Infrastructure in the western suburbs has been supplied, hasn't been supplied in the eastern suburbs. You've got terrible traffic and social infrastructure which hasn't been supplied. That's why people are complaining. And there are lots of other arguments which I won't go into because I don't want to take up too much time. But I think that you're mostly wrong because when you're living even in Chatswood, the adjoining suburb house price has gone up, not because it's the amenities have increased, it's because somebody thinks they're going to buy my house and put a 60-storey building on it as well. That's why the price has gone up.
Just to explain these numbers, the value of a new apartment to a buyer is essentially the price they pay for it. That's $873,000. That can be supplied without extra land. It can be supplied by just increasing the height of existing building projects. If we were to build 11-storey buildings instead of 10-storey buildings, we could supply lots more apartments at a low price without having to pay more for land. Now, you're right that the difference between these two is the land price. There's this huge profit from the development. Who's going to get that? Building residential construction is a competitive industry, and the developers will essentially bid up the land price so that until they essentially get a normal profit. And so it's the landowners that are capturing these enormous benefits without contributing anything to the process. So that's why we disagree. And were the planners to allow more buildings to be built, or even more especially allow existing buildings to go higher, then we'd see more supply and the price would fall. And it can keep falling to something like the marginal cost of supply of 500,000. That I think that's the key point. Infrastructure, yes, is a separate issue. I won't address that here.
John.
Yeah, John Connor. I don't represent any development group, but I have lived for most of my life in a mixture of apartments and houses, so both. Frankly, the argument's a very interesting one, but totally unsurprising in its conclusion. I think in many ways it's a straw man.
When you say that, you should be addressing.
No, I'm addressing you, because what you're saying is that essentially that values are not adversely affected in surrounding areas by home markets. And that to me is quite transparently obvious, because you do have a greater amenity. What you do have, however, I suspect, is a change in the populations. People to whom the amenity is important will come to that area. People who've lived there for their whole lives, for whom that amenity is not important, will have to leave it. Have to in quotation marks, and they will probably leave at a profit, but nevertheless they will leave it. So what you get is a complete change in the population. That's not an economic matter, it's a sociological matter, and it's a good deal more complex. One of the great advantages of economics is that it reduces most things to a matter of purely of price, which is fascinating, because on that basis I'm not sure what price you'd put on marriage. But nevertheless, what other things do you take into account? For instance, the infrastructure, the cost of providing greater parklands. If you take North Sydney, which is one of the examples you've used, North Sydney Council that area has the least area of parkland per head of population at the moment than any other area in Sydney, and it's going to get worse. Don't you have to counterbalance high-rise construction with, at the same time, a provision of greater amenity? And I don't just mean transport and shops. I mean in terms of parklands, green area, etc. One, and two, you have to look at whether you want your social composition to be comprised largely of people with no or very small families, or whether you will cater for different groups in places which have the amenity.
Right, so lots of issues there. On the issue of local amenities, one of the things that's included in this is infrastructure charges that all developers pay to both the state and the local governments for new developments, and they're very substantial. And there's actually been a very large in-depth review of this by the New South Wales Productivity Commission, trying to assess what's a fair basis for charging developers. But in principle, developers are paying for the cost of connecting new utilities, providing new parks, and so on. Now, you can argue that those charges are not high enough. David Tedeschi is the person to take those arguments to. But that has just been very thoroughly reviewed by the Productivity Commission, and they announced a whole string of reforms to bring the social costs of these developments into line with the social benefits. You mentioned something about the demographic benefits. The big issue in most of Sydney is that our housing is homogenous, that we have single-family detached housing. You can stand on a lot of the train stations in Sydney and you'll see single-family housing directly opposite you. That there's no diversity at all in many of the suburbs of Sydney at all. And so when families change and people move out, people want to retire, they want to still live in the same suburb, but they don't need 5 bedrooms anymore. They no longer have the option of finding a smaller place without the garden they can no longer look after, without the stairs that they find cumbersome. They have to move to a completely different part of the city, away from their social networks and their established life. So yes, diversity is a very big issue, and the biggest aspect of that, I think, is that we want more variety of housing in most of our suburbs. And almost always that means we want to provide higher density options.
Michael Potter, a former senior economist himself at CIS.
Yes,
Okay,
thank you.
Michael.
Yes, so I'm Michael Potter, as Tom says, and I don't represent anybody in the industry. I'm just wanting to explore one possibility for the results which you have, which I think are great results, by the way. Just looking at the price within the suburb which has the development. That, of course, is an average. So isn't there a possibility that you're actually seeing fairly substantial falls in the houses that are right next to the development and a moderate increase in the rest of the houses? So, very big fall right next to it, a smaller fall, and then it actually becomes an increase in the sub. If you're, say, 100 metres away, you actually get a price increase, but the people, sort of 1 metre next to it get a price reduction, but that's sort of averaged out, and so you don't actually see the that very distinct price fall right next to the development.
All right. Yes, good question. We look at median prices in each suburb as a unit of analysis, partly because it's just very simple and transparent. But overseas studies have done exactly the kind of assessment that you're looking at, and it's a lot more complicated and requires very big data sets. But the results of those overseas studies are very, very similar to our results. And so that typically they can study it down to the block or the 100-metre level, and they will find that prices drop, or in some cases increase, within 100 or 200 metres to fade away. But those effects are still very, very small in the overseas literature. So yes, the exercise you're saying is interesting and worthwhile, but there's been a lot of research along those lines, and it suggests the results are not different.
Peter, we are running out of time.
Okay.
Just give us a sense quickly of the next project.
Right, so we want to do more work in the housing area because, I think it's maybe one of the biggest disasters in economic policy in Australia. Mm-hmm. And as I said before, I think there's a really important information role to play here, that there's a big educational role. There are 2 big things on our agenda. One is we want to look at policy responses, and in particular the federal government's role, partly because the federal government already is actively involved with a lot of tokenism. They keep saying they want to be seen to be doing something on housing, but they're not actually delivering. The Biden administration in the United States has just announced very big support for zoning reform at a local government level, and it would be interesting to see the pros and cons of applying that in Australia. That's one big thing. The other thing we're very interested in looking at is resident opposition. In talking to people about these issues, we very, very often hear that residents initially oppose a development, but then once it's completed and once they see it, they change their mind and they say, well, that's actually not so bad at all, and I quite like these cafes, and I like the new amenities. We hear lots of anecdotes along those lines. We're interested in somehow combining that and measuring that.
And we should stress that this publication, as you demonstrated, mainly deals with the Sydney housing market.
Yes.
You're going to work on Melbourne soon too?
Yep. We're doing numbers in Melbourne and a few other places.
Great. Okay, now finally I'd like to call on my colleague and our chairman, Nicholas Moore, to make some concluding remarks. Nicholas.
Thank you all very much for coming. As Tom mentioned, this is our first event back after a year of COVID. COVID has been obviously a very challenging year for many people in our community, and here at the CIS it was challenging as well. This time last year we did see a substantial step down in revenue, as you would expect, particularly with events not happening. Fortunately, our staff, including Tom, were very generous in terms of stepping back in terms of their activity level, which was very helpful for us. But we did continue to get support from a whole range of you guys who are in the room today, so thank you very much for that. So that's my first point I'd like to make. We are really grateful for the support that we've received over this last challenging year. Our second point, of course, is to thank Peter and Tom for that presentation, and Zach. This is an issue, personally I feel very strongly about. I think it's, passion obviously it goes with Sydney house prices. I think all of us who have lived in Sydney, we are very engaged in the housing market. But of course, it's a much bigger issue in terms of the question of housing affordability. And coming out of that, of course, is the intergenerational inequity that's being created at the moment. I think we all know the story. I think Jessica wrote a very good article the other day in the Sydney Morning Herald dealing with this issue in terms of what's happening with the housing pricing from the point of view of the next generation. It's a very important issue. Obviously, housing is one of our largest costs that we all have in our life. I think, Peter, it's 10 to 30% of our income. So it's massive. And so if Peter's thesis is correct, and I'm a believer that we're spending half our housing costs in terms of things like planning permission, that's a really important issue. I mean, it can be a rational decision all democracies can take to actually enforce that cost, but we should recognise, and people should be aware of that cost when we're going for more and more regulation over housing. So I'm delighted that Peter has put it on the agenda. I think he's putting it on the agenda in a very effective way, in a way that we can look at and we can see the facts. We can debate what it means, of course, and that's what we're here about. But CIS, we put forward ideas, we expect a debate, and we hope that debate will flow through to good policies going forward. So again, thank you very much for attending, and Peter, thank you very much for the work you've done. I've been a fan since you've been at the Reserve Bank. And every piece of work you produce, I must confess, I'm really delighted to read, and it really does make you think. So thank you very much for that. So if we could thank Peter in the usual way. Thank you.